Not all gamers are collectors. But amongst those gamers that are collectors, many of them, including myself, go through phases. Kicks, where we seek to acquire... What the hell are you doing here? Well, look, I've been busy, okay? I've got a podcast that's listened to by dozens of people, and one or two of them pretend to like it. You'll take what I give you, and you'll be thankful for it. I am an aspiring social media influencer, and thus I can say and do whatever I want, and you're going to be thankful for it, you mother...
I think you're full of, I think I'm full of shit. I was so full of, yeah, I was so full of. I think I'm full of, I think you're full of, I think we're full of shit.
This is for Josephus with love. As I was saying, collectors go through a kick where you acquire a whole bunch of games by the same publisher, by the same designer, trying to explore the history of gaming. And for me, I definitely went through an Avalon Hill period, where I acquired all the bookshelf games that I could. And I tried a lot of them in classic wargamer fashion. Some of them I acquired because I liked the games, some of them I acquired because I just wanted more from the publisher, and some of them I acquired because I had a genuine fondness for the period of history. Now, very few of these games survive. I still have the designs by Richard Hamblin, and I still have my old copy of Up Front, but the rest of them I've gotten rid of. And one of the games that I acquired and then got rid of was the Republic of Rome. And the reason why the Republic of Rome had such promise for me was because of the promised interplay between politics and board state, and by extension, broader game state. And that unique alchemical mix is one that's done shockingly rarely in terms of gaming. Ultimately, I felt that the Republic of Rome fell apart in the same way that a lot of semi-co-op games do. In the particular case of Republic of Rome, what happens is there's this terrible threat that has to be confronted with incredibly overwrought rules. Someone does, they become some sort of god king, and then the entire game becomes about trying to topple them. I found it fluky and unsatisfying in the same way that a lot of semi-co-op games are. But that interplay between politics is always tantalizing. Now, some people will say that Twilight Imperium does this. They are, of course, wrong. Twilight Imperium has just an elaborated take that mechanism exacerbated by turn order shenanigans, in other words, very much like everything else in Twilight Imperium. Corporate America, actually, is one of the modern designs that does it the best. There are these policies that get passed, and you campaign for the implementation or revocation of various policies, and this interacts on top of the relatively good satire about corporate affairs. Despite the fact that corporate America doesn't take itself seriously, I think that more people should take it seriously because it gets a lot of things right, and I still enjoy corporate America a great deal. Then there are other negotiation games with the veneer of politics, and here I'm talking not about things like Sidereal Confluence, Trading and Negotiation, the Elysian Quadrant, say that 3 times fast, which is just a negotiation game. It's just about trading. There's no political element there other than the fact that when you get people together and there's the dynamic of forming trust, there's necessarily going to be politics. What I mean is some sort of explicitly defined political system. The kind that you might find in another somewhat satirical game, namely Chicken Caesar. There what you're doing is you're jockeying for specific political positions, and those positions allow you to exercise some control over the game state. But you don't really see much policy. The closest you get to in Chicken Caesar is you get to tax policy, which has a whole bunch of follow-on effects. So if you happen to be in that particular position, there's also a mini-game about applying guards. Anyway, Chicken Caesar is great, but the politics aren't very fleshed out. It's more about advancing your own chickens. I was very optimistic about Let Them Eat Cake, another game about the French Revolution by the brilliant Pierre Sylvestre, but it had one of the things in negotiation games that I like the least, namely hardcore restrictions and caps on how you get to use your influence. I'd like to vote for you, but I can't because the card that I have that lets me vote for you is in my discard pile, so I have to cycle through it. If you're going to do a negotiation game, it doesn't have to be purely freeform, but I like there to be enough freedom that I can support the people that I want to support when I want to support them. When it comes to the French Revolution, there's also the famous game by Martin Wallace, Liberté, which is utterly absurd in its theming in that the players are these bizarre ahistorical backers that are perfectly happy to back royalists as well as revolutionaries in the same table. And again, not really much about politics in Liberté, it's mostly just an area majority game. Which brings me to La Révolution française 1791-1795. This was published by Azure Wish in 1995. Azure Wish Enterprises is known for its sprawling World War I epic La Grande Guerre. It's also perhaps best known for having established the Europa Universalis series, which was originally a board game and then adapted into a PC game that is now in several iterations deep. The kind of games that they design are very much the kind of thing that you might expect to be adapted into a very complicated computer simulation, because a lot of their games are the kind of thing that some people, not myself, would play and say, I'd play it if it were a PC game, but I don't want to deal with all the overhead. And make no mistake, La Révolution française is a relatively complicated game. And when published, the rules were a complete mess. It was originally published in French, as you might surmise, and there are passages in the French rules that are not replicated in the English rules, and the translation is awkward and there are ambiguities. I and my group spent a lot of time rewriting the rules, and actually you can find our rewritten rules on the Board Game Geek website, and we had to make some decisions about some genuine rules ambiguities. Another thing that we did was we really cleaned out and consolidated all the information about the various political regimes, because that is the place that La Révolution française is peerless. It represents a whole bunch of different possible political regimes that might have happened during the French Revolution. About the timing and the framing of the game, though, you might notice that it starts in 1791. That is, of course, if you can parse French numbers, and if you can, you're probably smarter than I am. Many of you know that the Revolution is typically identified as starting in 1789. That's when the Bastille was stormed, that's when the Tennis Court Oath was taken, all those kinds of things. But they decided to start in 1791, the establishment of the legislature, which was the constitutional monarchy compromise exacted at the king. So the king is still around, he's still in power, technically, but he's been forced to cede some of it to democratic impulses. And that is where things start out, and that is where things are unstable. And I love that it starts at that period, very much like Hamilton, because here's the thing about Hamilton, and send your hate mail where necessary. I don't find the first half of Hamilton particularly interesting. Armed tax revolts, as a Canadian, don't really turn my crank, and so I find it hard to get swept up in the pageantry and magistry of a whole bunch of slave owners talking about freedom for everybody. The second half of the musical, though, that's where things get interesting. That's where these people, having found their power, need to start ruling, making compromises, cutting deals, finding obstacles, overcoming problems that are more interesting to my mind. And that is exactly how La Révolution française starts. One of the key hooks of La Révolution française, and one of the reasons why I tracked it down above and beyond my enthusiasm for the subject matter, was the way that it sets up the political factions. You're supposed to sit in order from left-wing to right-wing, and historical fun fact, that is where the terms right-wing and left-wing come from. In the National Assembly, the right-wing politicians, the ones who were loyal to the king, or who represented the king directly, sat to the right of the speaker, whereas the radicals, the ones who eventually wanted to do things like set up guillotines and committees of public safety, sat to the left of the speaker, and other people filtered in through the middle, and that's where we get left and right-wing. So let me identify the different factions here, because they're all very interesting. And I'm also going to give you a handy pronunciation guide, because many of my unilingual English, mostly Americans, but also some Canadians, have a great deal of difficulty with the different faction names. So here's your pronunciation guide. The murky middle that don't really care one way or the other, Murray. The war-making Republicans, Grande. The intellectual fire-breathing radicals, Montague. The constitutional monarchist, the Furry. Those loyal to the old regime of absolute monarchy, the Royale with cheese. And finally, you have the lower class, rabble-rousing, reactionary revolutionaries, Marie-Joseph Paul-Roche Gilbert de Moitié de la Lafayette. I trust that this will put to bed the nasty rumor that I cannot speak French and that I grew up in Versailles, Kentucky. Ultimately, it's the identification of these different factions that makes things fascinating. Now, to a certain extent, it sometimes gets difficult to identify the differences between some of the factions. In particular, the difference between the Sans-Culottes and the Montagne are occasionally tricky, because much of the time they're on the same page with respect to policy. And as a result, despite the fact that they're natural allies, the way the victory conditions of the game work, more on that later, they often end up in the fiercest competition. But that, of course, mirrors real life as well. Sometimes the fiercest debates aren't between the right and left wing, but it's between the left wing and the more left wing, or the right wing and the more right wing. One of the key mechanical hooks of the game that brought me in, that turned out to be relatively insubstantial, was you have to sit in the specific order. So you sit, the Royalists sit next to the Feuillants, who sit next to the Marais, who sit next to the Gironde, etc., in a kind of a U-shape around the table. And any game discussion has to happen at the table. So you can whisper to your co-conspirators or your ideological also-rans, but if you want to talk to somebody from the opposite side, you have to actually raise your voice and everyone knows what's going on. In theory, also, the Royalists are not allowed to transfer money or cut deals with the Radicals, which led to a fascinating element of gameplay, and I think this gives you a sense of some of the politics that are involved at the table as opposed to the politics that emerge from the rules. More on that later. The Royalists and the Radicals, in one of the games that I played, actually had common cause. They needed to do something to defeat the middle because the middle were running away with the game, and they needed the pace of the revolution to accelerate because the royalists saw their only chance of victory at a counter-revolution, which you can only get on the other side of the Committee of Public Safety in that particular plane. And so they tried to find a go-between to hand the money off to the radicals. But the money was intercepted, in effect. The royalists gave the money to the Marais, but then the Gironde, not wanting to help the crazy radicals, said, tell you what, Marais, I'm going to give you money out of my pocket for you to keep the money that was just handed to you by the royalist. And it worked. It was great. Feelings were hurt, names were called, bad words were uttered. Fun times. Now, the key thing about La Révolution française is that it doesn't have a central driving mechanism. There's a lot of things that go on. You have these historical personages that add historical flavor that you can send to specific parts of the country to try to do very specific things. You can try to pass legislation. There's a justice system that is different for every political regime. And there are all these different political regimes, all of which influence where people get to go and what laws get to be passed and how those laws are passed. And that is one of the key elements of the game that really makes it sing, but also makes it something of dizzying complexity. All the different historical regimes and potential regimes that are represented in the game. As I say, you start out in the legislative, but you can end up in the terror, the directorate, a thermidor, a second terror, a merciful terror. All manner of possible different regimes are represented, and they all work differently. A lot of this is driven by whether or not France is at war, because you can have domestic rebellion as well as foreign war. And naturally, the game state and the various levers of the game react differently to both of those pressures. And the fact that foreign war is represented, albeit in a very, very simple way, is one of the reasons why you might want to historically classify it as a war game, but not really. At the end of the day, though, when there's a unified front, you can send the people packing and you'll all be singing Marseillaise. On that topic. Okay, can we talk about national anthems for a second? I mean, I'm not a big fan of O Canada. Our national anthem seems to be preformed, ready for that particular style of music that could best be described as unenthusiastic, middle-aged Caucasian churchgoer. In fairness, most national anthems are subject to that to some degree or another, and I'm not a huge fan of the Star-Spangled Banner. I mean, I think it's better than O Canada, given that 78% of O Canada's lyrics consist of the words O in Canada. Look it up, it's true. It's pandemic times. Numbers are irrelevant and time has no meaning. But the French national anthem, La Marseillaise, now that is a battle anthem. Let me just share with you some of the lyrics. So the chorus is, to arms, citizen, form your battalions. Let's march, and this is my favorite line of any national anthem anywhere, let an impure blood water our furrows. It's like, yes, we are going to kill you, you vicious bastards, and we are going to let your impure blood flow throughout our country. That is some hot stuff. The children's verse, that is usually not sung in the traditional shortened national event version, but the children's verse is also pretty hot. It has the children singing the following about their elders. Much less keen to survive them than to share their coffins. We don't want to live past our elders that died in war. We want to die with them, say the children. Cheers! So as I say, there is a lot going on and the rules are a beast even when they've been cleaned up. But there's some guideposting. There are some short-term goals. There is the fact that at the top of every round, everyone declares a secret goal by writing it down. And if you've succeeded at that goal by the end of it, you get some victory points, or at least some fame, which makes your life a little bit easier. The government has to do that too. And the government is controlled by one of the party factions, but the two are kept different. They have different coffers, they have different finances, and oftentimes they have different goals and different things that they're trying to achieve. It's kind of evocative of 18XX or Imperial in that you have to play these dual-hatted roles. And the finance system, the way money works in La Révolution française is great because hyperinflation was a serious, serious problem during the revolution, as is common during revolutions. Anytime you spend money to do something, and most actions cost a lot of money, it goes into a pile, and at the end of the round, however much money has been thrown into that pile causes the inflation to move up, which in turn makes actions more expensive, which in turn drives inflation further up. Now, there are a number of ways to deal with this. One of them is through crippling legislation, which will make people real mad. But sometimes that's what you have to do. Sometimes it's in your interest to tank the government. Sometimes you know that the hyperinflation is one of the reasons why people are so mad that you're about to be tossed out on your rear end. And so as a result, you don't care if the government is saddled with debt because it's not going to be your problem next turn. These are some of the delightful interplays that all of these intermeshing systems lead to. And it's one of the reasons why even 25 years after it's been printed, and it's painfully out of print, La Révolution française still has a special place in the hearts of me and some of the players that I've introduced it to. Now, there are some serious problems. One of them is that the Marais always win. The Marais are indifferent to political system, and what's cool about the victory conditions of La Révolution française is what regime you find yourself in determines who is going to win. If you're in the middle of the terror, the royalists aren't going to win. And in point of fact, the royalists can't win unless they happen to lead a counter-revolution. Even the constitutional monarchy is too squishy for them. They're not a fan of that. They need the counter-revolution, which is a military option with foreign-funded armies and domestic royalist sympathizers to retake Paris. It's a daring thing, but it can happen. You can kidnap the king, you can put the king on trial, it's a whole thing. But the Marais are almost always eligible for victory. So just as in the terror, the royalists can't win, and in the counter-revolution, the radicals can't win, the Marais are happy so long as pretty much anything other than the counter-revolution happens. Compounding this is the fact that they just drown in victory points, where a lot of other factions struggle to get many. And so the Marais win handily all the time. Now, fortunately, in a 5-player game of La Révolution française, the Marais are abstracted out of the system and are replaced with a series of random events where sometimes regions become neutrally controlled. This is my preferred way to play now. I don't really think it's ideal at 6 anymore because, again, the Marais always win. But there is a sort of corollary to that problem of the victory conditions, of the rigid designation of who is eligible to be victorious in various political regimes. One of the features is that it gives you specific guidance on what the ranking is going to be. So it's not just whoever has the most victory points wins, and then you go on down the line and that's the ranking of the game. Absolutely not. You care who wins. It's not just going to be a straight calculation. And as a result, even if you don't think you're eligible to win, even if the tides have turned, say you're the Feuillants and the constitutional monarchy are long gone and you're trapped in a series of radical extensions of the revolution and blood's flowing on the streets, you still care what happens, and you can still try to exert power to steer things so that, yeah, you're not going to win, but you're going to be higher up on the ranking. And so there's always a degree of clarity, which you absolutely always want in games like this. There's a simple chart that tells you who you want to win as opposed to who you don't want to win and what regimes are more favorable to you. As a result, you can try to pare down this incredible sea of economic and political and military and personal information and try to figure out how to navigate things. And so it's still a compelling gameplay experience. I've had a lot of success showing La Révolution française to people who are not necessarily in the deep end of historical wargaming, and it's worked out great. That having been said, in the context of historical wargaming, there is a bit of a problem in that the historical events, as they happened, are not what you would call a plausible outcome. Historically, what happened between 91 and 95 was you started with the legislature, you then moved on into the convention, then to the terror, then to the thermidor, then to the directorate. And it was the failure of the directorate that ultimately led to Napoleon's ascension. And that's more or less when the game ends. But it's real hard to change regimes. I don't mean hard as in complicated. Some of them are complicated. It's like pass this bill and then do this thing, and then this army has to be over here and it can't be raining on a Tuesday. Sometimes it's as simple as just passing a bill. There you go, we're in a new regime. Usually, though, it's some combination of launch a coup in the right conditions, which is a very risky move, so you have to have players that are willing to stick their neck outs, and or we have to be threatened by foreign armies in various configurations, and then people panic, and you start instituting more radical regimes. This takes some time. You have to get your ducks in a row, and again, as I say, you have to play boldly. But that is when the game is at its best, when the game is moving along and you're developing these new regimes and you're exploring these new historical possibilities. Especially since when the threshold for changing regimes is comparatively lower by virtue of the willingness of the players to do those things, you get more opportunities for opportunistic play. You get more chances for people who are in behind to possibly snatch a second place out of the jaws of defeat, or maybe even the win. So many years on, painfully out of print, very hard to find, La Révolution française is a gem. A rough, unpolished gem with lots of crazy rules and occasionally some counter-historical impulses. But the scope and sweep and what it presents about not just the French Revolution, but about politics and about the changing political winds in time of post-revolution and foreign threat is absolutely peerless. And one of the reasons why I decided to come out of semi-retirement. Now you may be thinking, look, reviews should be buyer's guides, and I can't buy this product, so you talking about it or trying to analyze it or trying to share some of its genius is just a waste of time. Well, to that I can simply say I think you're wrong, but I forgive you.